a bit of things. And so it's very exciting that you are with us today as we kind of explore this important conversation that's happening alongside the conversations happening in New York City and around the world with the UN General Assembly, the 75th year anniversary of the United Nations. But more importantly, the conversations that we're having as a world, as a society, with COVID and pandemics and various other issues that are really riddling our communities, raising anxieties, and making people start to question the uncertainty of our systems, of our environments, and more importantly, how do we fix this? How do we get out of this mess? How do we start to understand what steps need to be made in order for us to progress? So there is a Q&A box, so please feel free to ask your questions. We'll get to questions and answers at the very end. But I am so proud and honored to be joined by Laura Cook, who is communications advisor for the Elders and a brilliant communicator, a photographer, a humanitarian, and somebody who has dedicated her life to figuring out how to communicate complex social, political, environmental, and human problems. So welcome, Laura. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here today with you all. And welcome to everyone joining us online now.
Yeah, and people are joining from all over. I'm really excited to see people from all walks of life. And as we continue to unpack this, we will go around the globe also by showing you stories that we've been able to highlight from different parts of the world. So as we're starting, I just wanted to kind of give you a quick overview about the Finding Humanity podcast. So we are a podcast that takes people to the heart of global and social injustice. Our goal is to help peel back the layers, to get people to start understanding and relating to issues that impact the world. Because so many times we're living in a world of apathy, not because people don't care, but people are overwhelmed by the magnitude of problems. When you say something like 79 million people are living as refugees, what we try to do with Finding Humanity is to introduce you to the people who happen to be living as refugees. And so it's a rebrand of the story. It's putting a human face on an issue, but more importantly, it's also diving into helping you understand, how do we get here? How did these people become displaced? What's the context that contributes to civil unrest? How do we close a blind eye to genocide that's happening all over, or ethnic cleansing, or issues like, child mortality rates going up, domestic violence rates going up, child pornography rates going up on the dark web? How do we start to unpack this? And we cover all these issues and more on our podcast. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start with our first question and let you hear. Apologies, whoops, the audio as always. Here we go.
You must be close. The archetype of how good is qualified is if you care for everyone. You defend the rights of everyone.
You must be close to the suffering that war produces to really understand why it's so terrible.
Women try to lead by example. They set the pace. They get it done.
You also need strong governments that can be strong enough to work with others and to protect their own people at the same time.
We haven't lost our instinct for human rights. The question is, how do we build back better?
This is Finding Humanity, a new podcast from the Humanity Lab Foundation and Human Group Media. Our inaugural season is made possible in part by our collaborating partner, the Elders. Through our podcast, we hope to educate and inspire you to take action, and together, create a better world for all of us.
And I'm super proud to have worked with Laura Cook and her brilliant team at the Elders to start to curate some of these conversations about global governance, about empathetic leadership. How do you bridge this gap between what we would consider the power structures of the world, our systems, our policing systems, our legal systems, our social systems, our governance systems, with what everyday people care about? And so translating these conversations into a space that makes public leadership relatable and makes public leadership accessible to the everyday citizen is also a big part of what we try to do through the Finding Humanity podcast, where we help people understand the legal issues, the social issues, the historic issues that helped us get here. So as you heard, our inaugural season partner are the Elders, and I'm excited to start kicking off by asking you, Laura, we are living in complicated times. And as we tell these very, very big, complex, ugly, murky stories. How do we differentiate between simplicity and making issues overly simplistic? What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a challenge that we face increasingly at the moment. And we're talking about storytelling today. And storytelling is so powerful, but we have to be increasingly careful that when we're communicating stories of change or of advocacy, that as communicators, we're not dumbing down the details, that we're not dumbing down some of the complex issues that our world faces. This doesn't help anybody. I do believe that there are ways that we can communicate things in an accessible way. And I think rather than talking about making things simplistic, making them simple, the difference there is it's about making them accessible so that people are able to delve into some of the difficult issues and challenges that our world faces, but to do so in a way where things are less complicated, but where we still appreciate and understand the complexities facing the world today. And when we are here meeting together during this Global Goals Week, this is incredibly important, because if these issues were easy things to solve or easy things to communicate, then we would be there already, and we're not, and there's a lot of good work to do. So it's vital that we try and find ways to communicate these issues in a way that people can access, people can understand, but also where people can get to the heart of some of the challenges that are facing the world today.
Well, I think that brings up a really important question too, which is how we have to start understanding the issues themselves in order to communicate them efficiently and effectively. And what I don't think people realize is how much work, how much background research goes in to us producing just one 20-minute episode of each of our podcast episodes. And I didn't even understand this process before we began down this journey, but we have a beautiful and amazing research team. We have Diana Galbraith, who's working with us on a lot of really finding the right speakers, which are the voices that are underrepresented. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. But really, how do you elevate voices that are already there, that are just not being heard? But then also just understanding the historic context, because so many times it's so easy to say, oh, well, this situation is happening over there, not realizing that our human behavior actually impacts what happens in places that we've managed to just pretend we don't impact or don't impact us. And so we literally have about 30 to 40 pages of research. You know, Martina Vanat, also on our research team for season 1, digs into, you know, history and how far back do you go, and competing perspectives and diverging perspectives, and why this perspective is there and why these people disagree with it. And all of that is really important for us when the process starts to go into production for each of these episodes. You know, the Human Group Media, our partners, dig into how do you frame the script, because how you choose to frame the story depends on what you're trying to achieve out of it. And we're going to get into that. But I really think it's important, because the script writing process, there is a responsibility that we have, not only to the people that we feature, but to helping people actually understand the complexity of why we got here. Because if we don't understand the complexity, we cannot simplify it enough to figure out how to dismantle these massive systems of oppression. And we're going to get into that in just shortly with some of the episodes from the elders, where, you know, Prince Zaid and Mary Robinson really talk actively around the human rights world. Like, what are the legal systems that are holding us in place? So with that, Laura, I want to ask you, because you do a great job of also really thinking about framing. It's a reason that I think you also excel as a communicator. So as we're thinking about balancing between real life portrayals and then this idea of sensationalizing imaging, how do you start to balance the integrity of the story of the person to where the person isn't re-victimized by the storytelling process, or they're not portrayed in a very small slither through their oppression story, but rather they are empowered beings and oppression happens to be one of the components of their narrative? What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, you just spoke there about responsibility and responsibility to the details and responsibility to the background research. I think there's also this responsibility, this duty of care that we have when we are talking about storytelling, and doing that in an authentic way and in a way that honors somebody's story. one of the first things I got told when I started out in communications by a very wise woman, a friend of mine, was that when we have somebody's story to tell, we need to treat that story as a treasured gift. That when we are holding somebody's story, we are taking part of them to share with the world. And with that comes a real responsibility. If we have a microphone or a camera or a video recorder to capture somebody's story, we are also in a position of responsibility to tell that story well. And I think even when you listen to the language of storytelling, to capture somebody's story, to shoot a photograph, those words themselves speak of the kind of power dynamics that exist there. And I think we need to be really conscious of that when we are storytelling. We need to really think about how we approach the story. So, for example, if we've got the privilege of sharing somebody's story with the world, are we ensuring that they understand how their story is going to be shared in the first place? Are we taking time to really listen to what they want to say? Are we putting in the work to ensure that they know not only how we're going to share the story, but where? You know, are we going to share this on social media? Are we going to share this in a newspaper? Are we going to create a video? Where will this be seen? And all of these questions are very, very relevant ones before you even put the story out there. And then beyond that, if we are going to be sharing somebody's story, how do we do that in a way, as you say, that doesn't minimalize it or diminish it? How do we make sure that we really show in all its richness somebody's story, somebody's perspective, and the reality that somebody is facing? And I think as communicators, we need to be asking ourselves those questions before we even begin to write our editorial piece, or before we even begin to create our podcast, so that we ensure that that's at the heart of what we're doing, and that we remain true to that real desire to share somebody's story and to maintain their dignity at the same time. I do believe both things are possible.
And I think that you bring up something really important, which I'm going to play
one of the
another episode.
Really troublesome things about a very troublesome crisis of COVID is that it exacerbates the intersectionality between poverty, gender, race, marginalization, being an Indigenous person, being a person with disability, all of this.
This crisis, it's not an unforeseeable accident. It was always known that a pandemic would come. What was not known, where the probability lay, was on the timing of it. And here we are, lifeboat Earth, where the Earth is almost in its own ICU. And it's not that it just happens. It's not force majeure.
We haven't lost our instinct for human rights. We're just in a very bad and bumpy time. We've got to come out of that.
The archetype of how good is qualified is if you care for everyone, you defend the rights of everyone.
Right. And this is interesting because a lot of our episodes, we talk about collective responsibility and shared responsibility. And that when I start to think about how we tell those stories, really the question of, is there such a thing as an unbiased perspective, is something that I am jarred with. And I say this as someone who's been in the humanitarian space and the human rights activism space, for over a decade. And the biggest challenge that I had, even while working at the United Nations as a communications focal point and an advisor, was really trying to understand whose side do you portray? And we're going to get into that in a little bit, Laura, I think, with some of the conversations I want to have about this idea of storytelling and who has the right and the power to tell a story. But I think the reason I want to bring that up is just the way in which you focus the lens is so important, and then how other people then understand it. And so when we're talking about exacerbated inequalities, as you just heard Prince Zayed, that episode really dives into understanding systems of oppression that are so interconnected, where you cannot talk about gender issues without looking also at human rights issues. And then also looking, for example, we dive into the UN Declaration for Human Rights, because to assume that everyone has the same start point in that conversation is oftentimes where we're failing at storytelling. We assume everyone defines gender equality the same way, or everyone has the same understanding of outrage, right? And the questions that we deal with and grapple with often in our podcast is, why is it that some issues and some stories create outrage and some don't? How do we as humans collectively choose which issues cause us outrage and which don't. And I'm going to just play the audiogram for an episode by Cherner Ba, which we went over. And it was really interesting because we're talking about COVID juxtaposed against his experience of going through Ebola. But the important thing about Sierra Leone in that episode was, and you'll hear it from our expert that's featured in the audiogram, is Sierra Leone has so much amazing beauty in it. So to scapegoat the whole country and simply look at it through the paradigm of the injustices, the poverty, and the crisis of Ebola that took place is also not fair to people like Cherner, who are passionate activists for things like gender equality and education and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and play that episode, and then we'll dive into our next question line.
Frankly, I've always been a bit of a noisemaker, just always been rattled by a sense of injustice.
Child marriage is one of the biggest factors that leads girls to drop out of school. And this is most the case in sub-Saharan Africa, which has the highest prevalence of child marriage.
Sierra Leone is best known, unfortunately, for the decade-long civil war that has been kind of immortalized in Hollywood films. And as a result, Sierra Leone's had a really tough time shaking the image of child soldiers and terrible abuses against the civilian population. Now, it's also been one of the most successful peace-building stories in Africa.
You have to imagine possible. You have to imagine different. You have to hold on to that. It's the most important thing we guard is hope, the belief that things can and will be better.
And there we have it. So let me ask you, Laura, why are these types of conversations for the elders and then for you as a storyteller so important?
For the elders themselves, I mean, the elders was founded by Nelson Mandela in 2007 and was founded at the time as a group of independent global leaders who'd be able to speak around issues of peace and human rights and to have those critical dialogues. And those critical dialogues are still important today. When we launched the podcast, I don't know if you remember, Hazami, but Mary Robinson actually said dialogue matters at this critical time. And that was why the elders wanted to collaborate on this and to take part in this, because dialogue does matter, especially on some of these complex issues and these critical conversations that need to be had. Ethical leadership and good governance on so many issues in our world today, from climate change to conflict to COVID-19, of course, and pandemics. These are all issues that do not have one simple solution. So therefore, opportunities to engage in this kind of dialogue matter. They're important. To me as a storyteller, I think seemingly intractable problems or challenges can sometimes just seem so daunting. And I think as individuals, perhaps we all feel a little bit lost sometimes with these issues. I think having opportunities to break down conversations, to be able to present different viewpoints on an issue, to be able to hear different stories and human stories also gives us the opportunity to then have conversations in our own context and our own settings and to create change. On these podcasts, the elders were able to offer their years of expertise and their experiences, but also to have a space to be able to collectively speak with that wisdom on some of these issues and the audience to be able to hear it. One of the privileges for me was to be able to support them as part of the elders team as the secretariat in doing that, but also was to be able to then listen to those podcasts and to be able to hear that advice and to be able to frame some of these issues in a different way. So I think having these spaces is not only important, I think it's vital. And we are now living in a world where, let's face it, I'm sat in my living room here in the UK, you're in the States, we've got people tuning in from all over the globe, and we're able to have these conversations and these chats. So while we might be facing difficult times, we're also living in a period of time where technology allows us to have these conversations on a global scale. And that's something to be excited about.
And I hope we never go back. I mean, we keep saying, I can't wait to go back to the norm. And as you know, Laura, I mean, with the Humanity Lab Foundation and a lot of the work that we do individually as entities is really trying to create a world that builds back better, right? And we heard that slogan a lot, but the world does not need more slogans. It needs more commitment to creating inclusive, diverse spaces where we do bring these stories in. So many times, because of restrictions of travel, because of the hardship of translation, or not knowing how to connect with different people, or people not wanting to share their story because there's real political and social consequences. And we go over that in some of our episodes, like the female genital mutilation and how hard it is to tell that story, or trafficking. And we go over that also in season 2 with human trafficking, and how so many times when trafficked victims come out and speak, they are not believed and they are not taken seriously, and there's shame riddled in that. And so it's not only, the stories that we tell, but it's how are we as society that listen to these stories creating a space that is safe for people to share their stories. And we go into that because storytelling is not just about telling the story. It's about shifting the conversation. It's about creating a space. And that's what I'm really excited about with our collaboration too. So I'm going to really quickly play, and I'm going to ask you, something that Laura, I know is near and dear to your heart, around this idea of storytelling isn't about giving people a voice. People have voices, right? It's about creating space for people to listen. And in the episode that we did with President Mary Robinson and President Juan Manuel Santos, former president of Colombia, the amazing part of that was how much of that journey was about listening. And so I'm going to ask you about that. Let's just play the episode, the audiogram for that first. Here we go. Whoopsie.
You must be close to the suffering that war produces to really understand why it's so terrible.
I've got a responsibility. I've got to try and show as a woman that I can involve women more, that I can really do something to make the peace agreement more inclusive.
This pandemic is demonstrating how important it is to follow evidence, the scientific evidence, not your political ambitions, but science.
I don't think that COVID itself is actually setting back the climate. I think, on the contrary, it's making us reflect more. But it is having an impact. People are thinking, they're listening to the science. The question is, how do we come back? How do we build back better?
So Laura, how is listening such a critical part of storytelling?
Yeah, that episode in particular is one of my favorites because that dialogue between Mary Robinson and Juan Manuel Santos, please do go and listen to that podcast episode if you haven't already, because they both speak much more eloquently than I could, actually, about the power of listening and about the power of others' stories on them. So President Santos recalled in that podcast episode a story around forgiveness in the midst of conflict. And Mary Robinson movingly spoke about women that she'd met who'd influenced her and inspired her with their stories in nations affected by conflict. Listening to stories of others is impactful, and a well-told story can not only emotionally move you, it can sometimes change your mind on an issue. If you are open to really listening and to really understanding someone else's viewpoint, that can shift your own thinking, and that's an incredibly powerful thing. Part of the Elders' mission is to engage with global leaders and civil society at every level in society, and to listen and to take part in dialogue with them. And supporting that diversity of voices for the elders, part of that mission is not just speaking to people, but it's listening to people as well. And in that vital work, in that vital dialogue, you're able to create spaces not only for those conversations to happen, but also for change to happen as well. So I think when we say, as you said, we should amplify the voices of others, perhaps, is the best way to put it, rather than to help them find their voice, because everybody has a voice. Everybody has a voice. And I think as storytellers, and we're all storytellers, we should be looking for ways to not only speak ourselves, but also ways to enable others' voices to be better heard, to turn up the volume, if you like, on some of the least heard voices in the world.
And one of the things I actually loved about that episode also, and I've had the privilege, obviously of having those conversations as the host of this podcast, but one of the things I found the most beautiful about that is how this idea that leadership is not about having solutions, right? It's leadership is about being able to collectively understand the needs of others and ethically and morally do something with it. Right. And so I think oftentimes, and I use the word poverty porn because I think we hear that a lot in the social impact space, where you see people going in and taking photos with children in underprivileged areas and so on and so forth. And that rubs people sometimes the wrong way, right? We have framings in the sociology spaces around this idea of white man savior complex and what that has historically meant in the human rights space. And I think it's important for us to not label things as good and bad, but really to create spaces in storytelling that allow us to actually suspend judgment and actually listen to what people are actually telling us. There's also something really powerful that I've learned through storytelling, which is storytelling is so oftentimes so much about what is not said. What do people choose not to share and why? How do they choose to show up in that conversation and why? Right? That's helps us start to understand stigma and fear of being portrayed in a certain way, and so on and so forth. And so I think the critical part of storytelling too is understanding that. And I'm going to play an episode that we did with Abby Stein on being trans and what it means to be a trans beautiful human in a world that is still struggling with the public kind of engagement around political correctness. How do you actually have a conversation when you don't even know how to have a conversation without being offensive? And we will also cover that in season 2 in our episode on bullying and on ideas of cybercrime and youth issues around youth kind of suicide rates going up too. There's a lot of conversations that we need to understand because it's taboo. We don't even know how to communicate about them, even if you have good intention. And so I'm going to go ahead and play Abby's episode trailer.
People ask me, oh, when did you realize that you identify as a girl? And I'm like, that's the wrong question. Because I never realized I'm identifying as a girl. My realization was that everyone around me thinks that I'm a boy.
When people come out within their Jewish community, wherever that Jewish community falls along Jewish denominational lines or political lines, it is very common still for people not to feel a full sense of belonging.
You know, in 69 countries in the world at the moment, same-sex conduct, same-sex activity is still illegal in the world today. A lot of trans people get caught up in the criminalization of same-sex activity.
In some twisted way, the silver lining of growing up in such a gender-segregated society is that it was very clear to me which side of the wall that separates man and woman, which side I belong at.
And the biggest challenge that we had in script writing for these episodes is how much context do you need to give to enable people to start relating to Abby, to understanding the fear Abby had from coming out, to understanding the shame that she felt. And you can hear all about her story in this beautiful episode. But we also do, in every single episode, feature experts that help you understand the context. Because I mean, Abby's story in isolation makes it seem like it is only Abby's story, and Abby's story is hers to own. But one of the biggest challenges I've even had, and we talk about this internally as a team at the Humanity Lab and Human Group Media with our podcast team, is how do we make it not seem like a specific culture or a specific society or a specific group is to blame for example, gender-based violence, when most of the stories we hear are happening in parts of the world where it becomes so easy to otherize and say, oh, that's happening over there, that doesn't happen here. And so we very consciously in our script writing process make sure that we talk about things and express bluntly and directly which frame we are using and acknowledge, and I think that's a really critical part that I've learned about storytelling, is acknowledge that this is the angle we have chosen and here is why. Giving people that knowledge to then hopefully be inspired to go on their own learning journey with the little bit that we've catalyzed of curiosity in their brain. So reactions, Laura, on this idea of this balance, right? And I know you're going to get into that in your next step, but you know, how does storytelling then differ from different mechanisms and different means of communication, where sometimes it is about giving information quickly, or maybe it is about shocking people with an infographic. Like, how is storytelling different?
I think we sometimes start talking about storytelling as if this is something new, and it's something that we've just discovered in the last few years, especially with the advent of social media. You know, storytelling is a very trendy thing to speak about, but actually this isn't something new. Human beings have storytelling inbuilt. We have been telling stories for tens of thousands of years, if not longer. They know, for example, in the Pyrenees, in the mountains in France, there was a series of cave paintings found that they say dates back at least 35,000 years. 35,000 years. And that was people telling stories then visually. We know the oral tradition of storytelling goes back even further. And no matter which culture you're in the world, you will have your folk tales, your fairy tales, your stories that you've grown up on. Sometimes it's from a book, but it could equally be from your grandparents passing that story down. It could be through song, it could be through poetry, it could be through chants. Our proverbs and our fairy tales and our mythology still act as a moral compass in the world today. In fact, when you look at some of our legal systems in the world today, it doesn't take very long to find that some of those are founded on ancient stories that have been passed down. So these things are still just as relevant to us now. But when we're telling stories today, we also have to be aware that we live in an age where it's very easy to take somebody's story, and as you're saying earlier, to twist that, or to only show one side of it, or to present it as the whole truth or the whole story. And we need to be careful to do that, not to do that, because stories can break down barriers, they can generate creativity, they can allow us to open up doors into worlds we might not otherwise see. But they can also change your mind, as I said earlier. So we have to be careful that we are as authentic as we can be in presenting what we say. And stories are incredibly relevant right now, because I think so often when we look at things, for example, like the global goals, the sustainable development goals, that's a lot of information to take in, and it can be very tempting just to present that in an infographic, as you say, or just to share statistics. And statistics and numbers have their place. It's important, of course, that we rely on science, that we rely on facts. But if we just bombard people with statistics, it's not going to take very long before either people are not listening or before people do not understand. As human beings, we respond to stories. So it's adding a face behind the numbers. It's adding personal engagement behind the statistics. It's showing that behind these facts, behind these figures, there's humanity. And all of us, whether we are leading a country, whether we are leading a community group, whether we are just sat at home listening as an individual, we have it built in to respond to that humanity in storytelling. So we're missing a trick if we only present things through statistics and figures. We need storytelling to bring those statistics and figures to life.
I think it brings me to, in one of the episodes that I truly loved was Nujeen Mustafa's story, and she was recently profiled on BBC. Beautiful story. She's a Syrian, Kurdish originally, Syrian refugee who made it to Europe through on a wheelchair. And it was really interesting because I learned so much by listening to how Nujeen told her story. And this is where I think public learning is a big part of storytelling. Allowing people to teach us and to correct us without this desire to be offended. I asked Nujeen, and I'm expressing this openly as a public learning experience, I asked Nujeen, what does it feel like to be bound by a wheelchair? And she stopped me. She said, I am not bound by a wheelchair. It is how I get around. She said, what if I asked you what it would be, how it's like to be bound by your legs? And for a moment there, I could have gotten flustered, but instead I was like, you know what, Nujeen, that's fantastic. And I want to actually use that as learning in the episode, which we did. And so one of the things that I think we have to think about is this idea of activism and how we use these stories to then create advocacy and activism. We are living in a world where I think it's hard because long form storytelling takes time. And people often want quick sound bites. And what that then creates is communications that's trying to keep up with it. Because if you look at most big nonprofits, organizations, and I can say this as someone who's worked with the UN on communications, it's hard because you know that you have very limited attention spans. And we know that fear drives action. And so how can you, if you have this very limited time, create a call to action while also raising awareness? And I think it creates an unfair responsibility and burden on communicators of these big organizations that do need people to listen, because changing, I always say, in our episodes, that a lot of the issues that we're grappling with the world are behavioral issues that live in hearts and minds. Racism, hate crimes, the behavior that allows us to collectively as a society commit genocide or suppress people or abuse people or marginalize people. These are ills of the hearts and minds. And we do get into that in our episodes, but it's important because how do we make that accessible and not overwhelm people, but then also not create it too long to where people just completely check out? And that's the space that I think is a really hard balance, because we do live in a world of what I would call, clicktivism or slacktivism, because communicators are fighting for your ears. They're fighting for attention. So how do you balance that? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that specifically, Laura.
Yeah, I think this brings us back, doesn't it, to that question around the difference between simplifying and making something simple, and being really careful that actually we don't oversimplify things, that we recognize complexities and that we recognize the differences. And we need to be so careful that our storytelling doesn't get stuck in a rut. I think in the global north in particular, we're often guilty of this, where we present in our stories this kind of one solution fixes all, and often it's presenting a protagonist who faces an insurmountable problem and then a hero rides in and saves the day, and that becomes the narrative for things, and that's not reality. And in fact, by doing that, we're doing a real disservice not only to the story but to the kind of change that we would be able to create if we were a little more honest with our storytelling. When we talk, for example, again about the global goals, so often we do look for quick solutions in our storytelling rather than recognizing the diversity and scale of solutions that could exist to solve problems. I think this is problematic for two reasons. I think, first of all, if we fail to recognize the complexity of the global issues we face, we stand less of a chance of solving them. And that's a problem. But secondly, it also fails to recognize the agency and the agenda and the creativity and the amazing potential of people whose voices are less often heard. So often this tends to be people in the global south or people who are marginalized, minorities. And one of the great things about this podcast series is that a platform is given to voices that are perhaps less often heard, or from nations that are less often heard from. But we also need to create spaces for dialogue where we can understand someone's viewpoint, even if we don't agree with it. In the episode with Juan Manuel Santos and Mary Robinson in that we saw earlier, he speaks very eloquently about the need for dialogue where you may not always agree, but where you can sit down and listen. And I think that's really important in our storytelling, that we're not always trying to speak either to people that are just going to agree with us, but also that we're presenting these different viewpoints. So people can go away and can then form their own opinions and off the back of that take action.
And I think that's really important as we think about what we're doing with balancing the sides of the stories that we tell. One of the big issues that has come up for us again is really this idea of shifting our desire to judge. And so, for example, we do talk about the illegal smuggling that's happening of refugees, of people fleeing war zones. But we also, because we're aware of people using that and saying, well, they shouldn't do it illegally, we feature voices of experts. And Mary also talks about this. We don't have legal processes to help people that are fleeing injustice. And so how do we move away from innately wanting to use stories to validate our perspectives and our views? And I see some questions coming in. I'm going to go ahead. I know we're going to get into Q&A, so we don't have much time for it. So keep your questions coming and I'll try to integrate them as much as possible. I'm going to play Nujean's podcast episode because I did not actually play that earlier, and then we're going to continue on. And Laura, next I want to really figure out, so just to prep you on this idea of advocacy and civility. How do we balance that? And you talked about that with Santos. How do we give space to listen, even to people that disagree with us, or politicians that maybe we don't relate to, or we're frustrated by? So that's coming up next. This is Nujeen Mustafa's episode.
I try to learn something new every day and try to fight the stigma that surrounded a person with disability, because I knew nobody expected that I would achieve anything, so I tried to prove everyone wrong.
Protests began in Syria in March 2011 in the context of the broader wave of mass protests that swept across much of the Arab world.
Women and girls with disabilities in particular, globally, face greater risk of gender-based violence.
Please do not let anyone discourage you from being passionate about whatever you find as your purpose or cause.
So how do we balance civility? And I know there's a question here about storytelling is a great means of solving conflict, but in some places that's not working, where leaders choose not to listen. And I know we do talk about that in our episode around global governance, around is the UN fit for purpose? Where do we go from here? And so, Laura, how do we create spaces for listening around advocacy and civility?
I think going back to something I said earlier, and this is not saying it's easy, but in the world today, we at least have the option to be able to communicate in so many different ways that we didn't even a few years ago. And I think there are different places that we can create space for these conversations. There are different platforms we can create space for these conversations. And increasingly, it's then looking at ways where those voices are not just there, but are going to be listened to. One of the great things with this podcast, and one of the reasons that we partnered with the Humanity Lab on this, was that we really wanted to work with someone who shared the same kind of values as the elders do. And we found that in this podcast. And one of those values that's at the core of this is really valuing opportunities to present different voices and to listen to different voices and to create that dialogue. I don't think this is an easy thing to solve. And I see in the questions as well here that there are countries where it's very difficult for people to have a voice that's listened to. But I do think that we should continue to try and to continue to be putting our voices in spaces where they can be heard. And it may not be a podcast for everybody. I mean, if giving tips around communicating, it may not be a podcast, but we have a whole plethora of opportunities in 2020 to be able to have these conversations, whether it be online through blogs, whether it be in discussion forums like this one here, whether it be in writing articles, whether it be in creating videos and media for social media. We do have these opportunities to share. I mean, Hazami, I might throw it back to you because I know you've been doing so much work as well here around engaging people in these kind of conversations, not only through the podcast, but outside of this as well.
Yeah, and I think you brought up something really important, Laura, too, which is that it's important for us to challenge ourselves, right? So many times the problem with communications is that we opt into listening to what validates our broken perspectives. And I say broken perspectives because we have to realize, and again, this is something I've had to reconcile with, there's no such thing as a fully neutral perspectives. We have biases in some way on some issues, and it doesn't have to always be attached to ill intent. Sometimes people just don't know how to have conversations. Again, so one of the things that I've learned through this process is learning to suspend judgment and to empathize with other people and with myself, and ask questions. When I come across roadblocks, I ask questions. And we don't try to scapegoat these issues at all in this podcast. We actually ask controversial questions. We actually challenge governments and leaders to be more accountable. But we do that while also asking citizens to realize our role, because we live in a blame culture, and the communications that works based on algorithms of social media and all these other algorithms, divisive language makes it further. Let me stress that again, divisive language actually works better. There's a book called Words That Work, and it talks about how fear drives action. Hope does not. necessarily drive as much action. And so how can we also challenge our society to stop sensationalizing the issues that we encounter? And this is true of understanding systems, which is the cornerstone of our work. And I see that someone has written here, which is very true. I mean, Farai Gundan has said something around cancel culture. And it's so true. So many people are afraid to speak because we do live in that, but we are part of that very culture. And I think that's where storytelling has a responsibility, and we have responsibilities for stepping up and saying we need to create these spaces. We cannot just keep shutting out perspectives that are different, because we are never making progress. And we talk about that in our episodes where we talk about the complexity of change, because we are not apologetic. We are actually saying we're failing. But acknowledging we're failing means you have to dismantle a system. And dismantling a system, the responsibility is collective. It is not a government. Again, we talk in our episodes around hate crimes and racism, right? Racism, if I choose not to act on my racist thinking, does that mean I'm not racist? No, racism it's plaguing our societies in the hearts and minds and in institutions behind closed doors. So that's where I think it becomes really important with storytelling, to allow us to create space to challenge ourselves, to challenge each other's, to suspend judgment, and especially the long form. I think it works better. So I'm going to go into the episode really quickly with Dr. Gru Brundtland, because, when we're talking about COVID and we're talking about exacerbated inequalities, right? This idea that we are meeting here in parallel right now with the United Nations General Assembly, which up until this year has been one of the most exclusive decision-making processes that we have, because just the geographic restrictions of who can travel to New York, who can't, the carbon footprint that's involved, and so on. So I'm going to go ahead and play this episode. And then, Laura, I'm going to jump straight on into tips, because I think that's what a lot of people are here to get. And please do keep your questions coming. If we don't get to them, we are committed to continuing this conversation. So here we go, Dr. Gru Brundtland and Mary Robinson.
One has to realize that to have good multilateralism, you also need strong government. Governments that can be strong enough to work with others and to protect their own people at the same time.
I know that the word multilateralism sounds to some people like globalization. It's not actually that. Multilateralism is the cooperation between countries to solve problems that are too big for a single country. We need to reinforce all the values of multilateralism.
There is no way to influence governments to be forward-leaning and taking charge and being responsible unless you have a public pressure to require leaders to do the right thing. The importance of civil society is absolutely crucial now and in the future.
And a big part of that, Laura, is knowing how to advocate, right? A lot of what Dr. Gru Brundtland talked about was being able to activate and advocate for issues that you care about. And a big part of that is the story. Why is there urgency when we're living in a world of competing urgencies? So can you give us some tips for people that are listening? How can people communicate more efficiently and effectively on sensitive issues?
I think, first of all, you need to ask yourself, are you the right person to be communicating at all? So tip number one is, are you the person best placed to be communicating on a sensitive issue? Or is there somebody who would be better to do that? I think this is a big question to those of us who are, first of all, in the global north, who are white, and people who often have their stories heard. We need to sometimes be really seriously asking ourselves, is it time for us to take a step back and to allow others to tell their story authentically themselves? So tip number one, are you the right person to be telling the story? If you're not, who would be best? And are you able to support them or be an ally in enabling that to happen? Tip number two, if you are telling somebody else's story and not your own, really ensure that they understand how it will be used and where, which goes back to this dignity and to ensuring that people are involved in that process. Find ways to really help them understand the audience you're telling that story to. I think so often as communicators, we can be very focused on the audience and what the audience are going to hear, but we also need to remember the person whose story is being told. tip number 3, which Hazami, you have mentioned so well around this podcast, which is back up your storytelling with facts and research. This doesn't mean you need to include every single fact in the way that you tell the story, but it's incredibly important if you are telling a story on a real world issue like conflict or climate change or gender inequality, that you do your background research, that you really take time to understand the different perspectives that exist. And that will help you then frame how you want that story to be told. Tip 4, decide the best way to tell your story. Is this going to be through a video? Is this going to be through a song? Or is this going to be in a long form format like a podcast? I mean, Hazami mentioned the long form format earlier. So for those of you that don't know what we're talking about, that means a space where you're able to engage over a longer period of time and to really be able to get to grips with an issue. One of the great things with the podcast, and one of the reasons the elders wanted to engage with doing a podcast, is it creates a space where you are able to hear different perspectives and you are able to go into some of the nuances that you just simply can't do in a 1 minute Instagram video, for example. So look at how you're going to share. And lastly, be creative and have something that goes beyond the story you're telling. Why are you telling the story? At the end of that story, do you want somebody to take action? If you do, give them the tools to be able to do that. So that might be a source of more education or information. That might be an action that they can take to respond to what they've heard. Because a story is only truly a powerful story if it then pushes or persuades somebody to then go and do something else with it, whether that be pass it on, or to take action, or to write to your government on an issue, whatever it might be. But you need to really think as your last step, what is it I'm wanting to get out of sharing that story with my audience?
That's really helpful, Laura. And I'm going to play the episode trailer that we did on food insecurity in Yemen and looking at the war, because I think a lot of what you talked about is so important around this idea of kind of choosing which form works. And one of the things that we had to also think about, as I mentioned, is the framing of those, of those episodes. For example, Yemen in people's minds right now immediately triggers this picture of famine and war, which it should, because it's one of the biggest sores and failures that we have in the world today, right? We have failed the people of Yemen and a lot of other countries that are crying out for help, but their cries are falling on deaf ears. But we chose not to tell it through that paradigm. We chose to tell it through the story of a beautiful coffee entrepreneur, and I'm gonna share his audiogram, who has decided to uplift the farming community around the production of coffee. And again, it challenges people, because I didn't even know this. Mocha actually came from Yemen, the mocha that we all drink. And so we want to now have people equate coffee culture, things that bring us so much joy, with what's happening in Yemen, to help us realize that the people behind the scenes are beautiful humans that have lives, passions, dreams, and aspirations. So here we go with the Yemen episode.
I think some of the best conversations that people have are usually around cups of coffee. But I really fell in love with its potential for us as humans. Then I found out that coffee production in Yemen basically was almost extinct.
Sadly, in 2014, things took a turn very, very south with the beginning of this current conflict.
In Yemen, there is no shortage of food. It's people's purchasing power that has been totally devastated by the conflict.
There can be a lot done to empower regular Yemenis to not only build their resiliency in the current conflict, but to empower their opportunities in the long term.
I had this idea of I'm going to take coffee beans out and bring it to the world. People would laugh at me. There are things right now that we need much more than coffee. But I did it. And I didn't know that it would have this kind of macro impact.
And so I'll just add to a few of the tips you offered, Laura, and also kind of add my own, specifically from how did we get these stories? How did we get to the heart of these stories? Number one is we as a team became radically curious. I love this idea of radical curiosity, where I recognize my own bias. And we have calls where we plan out each episode with our team and our research team. And I say, look, I might be biased because I'm so close to this issue. right? I am a Syrian Palestinian immigrant woman. And I have a different perspective because I'm close to that issue. And it's one that's near and dear to my own heart. And that's where, again, we dive into research. To what Laura said, we have research to back up our claims. It's not just an emotional, you should care, but then we figure out how to make that issue relevant. So radical curiosity is how we get there. How do we get to the heart of the research that we need? The second is to ask questions. When I don't know things, even with our team, I constantly tag them on documents when we're script writing. And I say, how would this resonate with this audience, this audience, this audience, this audience? Not because we're afraid to say things. We say things that are very provocative in the podcast. But what we do is we do that because I want to be aware of how and what reaction I will get. And it's to Laura's point, being aware of the outcome that you're trying to create is so important. We intentionally choose to share, and I use the word intentionally, very intentionally, choose to share different sound bites in order to provoke the emotion, the awareness, and the learning that we want people to get out of this episode. There's a very big intentionality that goes into that. The next question, the next point I would say is listen with the perspective of evolving, right? A big part of successful storytelling is you go down a rabbit hole, right? We have interviews that then lead us to interviews that lead us to more data, that leads us to more research. And we realize, I always say, I try to break through this idea of expert syndrome. We're living in a world where everyone now is an expert on your social media feed. Like as soon as there's a next disaster, everyone's going to automatically become an expert on the topic. We don't need more experts in the world. The world is not short of experts. We're short of empathetic ecosystems of collaborative development, where every single person steps back and says, how can I be part of the solution around this? So testing assumptions is a great way to do that. Testing your audience, testing your conversations, testing your tools, testing how messages resonate is a great part of thinking about how do we shape these. And then once you've figured out your tone and your voice, which we have figured out in our podcast, we back it up with data. So if people come back to us, we talk about radically challenging issues, right? In next season, we're going to be talking about the Rohingya, and we're going to be talking about the Uyghur community, the ethnic cleansing happening right now in China. And so we intentionally figure out how do we tell the story and be aware of what's going to come out of it, and then stand in our truth, backing up with data. And then the last thing I would say is defining your goal and objective. I'll reiterate the point that Laura said. Our goal in this podcast is not to give you answers. It's to create critical thinking that creates empathetic leaders in every single one of us. And I love the saying, we wait for leaders to come rescue us instead of becoming leaders and rescuing ourselves. And the very premise of our podcast is like, people have so much power. And how do we then come together collectively to start pushing the system per what Dr. Grube-Brundtland said? How do we push a system to want to change, right? Equipping yourself with knowledge is the biggest way to stop conversations from getting emotional, right? But it's also realizing that data is selective. And we do talk about that in our episodes. Some countries, we don't have data sets. And that comes up in some of the episodes with death rates, where there's the Cambodia episode. There's just multi-millions of people that are unaccounted for. That's political in and of itself. Which data do we collect and why? Which data do we choose to showcase and why? So we embed that all in because our goal is to disrupt. Our goal is to inspire. And our goal is to hopefully infuse a new way forward on critical global issues. So with that, I know that there has been some questions that have come through, and we only have a minute left. So Laura, I'm going to give you the final word on how can we empower young people to learn about the art and power of storytelling. And that question came from DJ, who's the director of partnerships at World YMCA, which reaches 65 million plus people all over the world. So any tips on that, Laura? In a minute, a very short tip. No, storytelling belongs to all of us. I mean, that's what I would say. Storytelling belongs to all of us. In each and every one of us is a storyteller, and we all have that inside of us to be able to share. We all have a story. We all have value. We all have worth. And I think something that we can do as communicators, whatever walk of life we're in, is first of all, own our own story, but secondly, look for ways where we can share others. And that might be as simple as sharing somebody's story that moves you online, a simple share, a simple retweet.
It might be as much as actually saying this is a story that needs to be heard and looking at ways to more powerfully share that beyond. Nelson Mandela, who founded the Elders in 2007, he founded the Elders with the interest of promoting the shared interests of humanity, of recognizing that we're only human through the humanity of others. And that's part of the Elders' mission now. As an individual, I respond to that by saying we all have humanity, and we also all have the ability to recognize humanity in others. And to me, that's what storytelling's all about. It's about finding those opportunities to show the human face behind the stats, behind the numbers, and behind some of the big issues that face us all globally today.
And with that, I thank you, Lara, for joining us. I have up on the screen, please do check out season 2, listen to all of season 1. We have 13 beautiful episodes, so much heart, passion, blood, sweat, and tears went into this. I just want to send some love out to Camille Lorente, who is our executive producer who couldn't be with us today, and Maverick Aquino, who is the amazing talent behind all of the genius, creative genius that you see. And as mentioned earlier, Diana Galbraith and Martina Vanat, who have contributed so actively to the curation of season 1. So thank you to our team who has brought these stories to life with blood, sweat, and tears through some of the craziest storytelling experiences that we've ever had to take on collectively. So with that, thank you, thank you, thank you. Stay tuned, engage with us, follow us on social media, and a massive thank you to Lara and to the Elders for your partnership, for your passion, for your wisdom, and for lending the voices of so many that came before us. We all stand on the shoulders of giants, and we can only move forward if we bring the beautiful parts of our past and chart a new way forward that is based on justice and fairness. So thank you to everybody, and we hope to see you on the flip side.